Hey everyone, welcome back to Lit Code Club. My name is Nicole and I'm a counselor at Moon Prep. Today I have Muskan with me and we're going to be doing part 2 of our parent series on how to best support your students. So tonight, part 2 is with our current juniors. So don't forget to like and subscribe to get more BSMD med school admissions advice. And we're going to dive in. So, last time we talked about seniors, current seniors, class 2026. This is going to get into current juniors, so class of 2027. So, Muskan, I'm going to go ahead and ask you kind of what you think about certain things with our current junior class. Spring is a huge time for, and summer, it's a huge time for scheduling visits to colleges because this is kind of when we're getting into making our list. So, give us some of the advice or some of the things to consider, ways to support your students when you're going to plan to go on these college visits.
Yeah, of course. I think college visits are a really essential part of your underclassmen years. You can get a sense of what different campuses are like, what different schools really value, and it can just be kind of nice to get exposed to the different types of colleges before you start really thinking about what your list is going to look like. So, I will say probably in the beginning of your high school journey, in freshman year or sophomore year, you can be a little bit less picky with what you're doing, where you're going on visits. I would say to try to visit, large public universities, private universities, STEM focused, liberal arts colleges. If you're interested in Ivies, I would also recommend trying to visit an Ivy. But just keep in mind that these first few visits, you're really just trying to get an idea of what types of colleges do you think you would fit in best at. When you start to get, a little bit later in your high school journey, the summer after sophomore year, junior year, we want to be a lot more intentional about these visits because, obviously visits are costly, they're time consuming, and we don't exactly always have, all the time in the world to be able to just go visit a school, especially if it's really far away. So we want to make sure that once we have an idea of, these are the types of colleges I'm interested in, we start to be more intentional about the ones we want to visit and, doing research about these are my top choices so that we're being more selective. One thing that I will say is that you might not end up applying to every college you visit, and that's okay. I would still encourage students to start these visits early. I took my first visit in freshman year of high school, and I didn't apply to that college. But I think it was just, it was a warm weekend. I just went into a college near the city that I lived in, and it was a good experience because that first college visit, you probably just don't know what to expect. So the first one was more so just me trying to understand, how do these run? What are things to look for? What is the vibe of the campus like? But once I got into my later years, I was a lot more intentional about, when am I going to spend time and money to go to these colleges to see what they're all about. And then also one thing that I want to add is that if you are unable to go to a college, let's say you live in California and you really want to check out an Ivy League on the East Coast, I would also look into virtual programming for those colleges. So sometimes high schools will have representatives visit, or you can just look on their website to see if they have like an information session. Those are also good ways to engage with these colleges before you start to make your list and apply in senior year if you don't have the ability to actually travel to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Great advice. Keeping an open mind for everything, not just kind of closing in on one. Like you said, there's so many things that impact you if you do your first visit and it's like beautiful weather and great, a great time. I think a lot of kids sometimes are skewed by fancy buildings and really beautiful landscaping, things like that. But really keeping an open mind and visit all different types of places. So in terms of, kind of making the list of where you're going to apply, and, we're going to dive deeper into how to make a full college list, actually during our next episode, but a little bit here. What kind of broad categories do you go into or think about when you're thinking about where you will apply?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And this is something that I think students also get a little confused about because there are, quite frankly, there's a lot of options for students nowadays. So, first, what we think of is just the traditional pre-med track, which means you go through 4 years of college, and then you will go through another application process to apply to medical school. That is, by far the most popular route for students across the country to go to. But here at Moon Prep, what we really specialize in are these combined programs that allow you to gain a conditional seat both in a bachelor's degree program as well as a medical degree program. So even within these combined programs, there's two different options. You can have a BSMD or a BSDO. There can be a lot of confusion about what an MD is versus a DO. And broadly speaking, they're just different philosophies of how medicine is approached. We probably don't have time to go into the really intricate differences between the two different degrees today, but this is something that you can reach out to your counselor about or do some research on your own. And if people are interested, I'm sure we could have another podcast about MD versus DO, but this is a consideration to have early on when you're starting to think of, what categories might you be interested in. Also, the competitiveness between all three of these tracks definitely differs. So that's another thing to talk to your counselor about based on your stats, where they think that you would have good chances of succeeding. There's some other options as well. We do have some students who take a bit of a non-traditional path. So, you can go through 4 years of college and then apply to med school and have done any degree. So we have students who will major in engineering and English and, finance, business, anything of the sorts. And then we also have students who are, with us who aren't really interested in medicine. So that's another thing to consider as well is, is medicine your track, or are you thinking of applying to different types of degree programs? I've even had students who, will apply to BSMD programs specifically at the schools that they would be really excited about. But then at like their state school, maybe it's really great for engineering. So they apply for a bachelor's in engineering with the goal of potentially applying to med school later. So that's something that a lot of students don't realize, is that you can truly major in anything in undergrad and still have the opportunity to apply to med school as long as you are meeting all the prerequisites and the requirements. And then finally, one big broad category that a lot of students are interested in are IVs. We also tend to make sure that, students are competitive enough when we're recommending these lists to them, just because we want our students to have the best possible chances. But that is another category to keep in mind when you're trying to think of, hey, where do I see myself fitting in for the next 4 years?
Yeah, it was a great point. We mentioned this last time. Some families are, BSMD or bust, or some, I don't want to do DO programs. I only want this. It's really important. It's really key to kind of keep it broad. For now, keeping broad categories and do the research on the broad categories versus just keying in right now early on. And I've absolutely had the same thing that you were mentioning, BSMD, we're going to, do those majors, those, bio majors and whatever's recommended for those. But then if I'm going to go to this college, I'm going to be a humanities major or an English major, or, pick up a poetry, secondary major or something like that. Having other interests elsewhere is completely fine. And just, again, keeping a broad, like I said, keeping broad categories for now. There's tons of time to kind of key in on things later on. So those are some broad categories for the list. And I know I said we're going to be talking about exactly how to create a list next time, but what are some other things that you consider or you want parents to help their students consider when creating a list?
Yeah, so like Nicole said, we're not going to get super in depth about the lists in this podcast, but these are some things to consider, and these will also help you guide which schools to visit and, you know, other considerations of like which schools to join virtual programming for example. But the first broad category that we always put schools into is safeties versus targets versus reaches. I'm sure a lot of students have heard of these categories, but safeties are generally schools that we feel pretty comfortable about, that we, you know, we think that with your stats that you have a good chance of getting into. Targets are generally matched. These are also pretty comfortable, but maybe you know, you're not as sure about a target as a safety. And then reaches are the schools that, you know, we are really we hopefully still have a good shot at, but are on the higher end of the spectrum in terms of stats. And, you know, they're kind of just difficult for any wonderful student to get into. So those are the three broad categories to think about. And when you're starting to visit these schools, maybe, you know, visit a few schools that you think might be a safety for you, a target or a reach, just so you're kind of getting some variety in your college visits as well. And this is something that your counselor can definitely help you have realistic expectations about. Another thing that you can do is set a list of criteria at this time. So this isn't exactly creating your college list, but this will help you in the future. Things like price, distance from home, you know, crime rates in the city, that is always a big consideration for a lot of families. And anything else that you know is a definite no or yes. These are things that you can start at least brainstorming at this time of what criteria do you want the school to fit into. And then when it comes time to actually make the college list, it'll go by so much more smoother because you'll already have these criteria well defined.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, you know, last time we talked about you'll have the time to really, really get into the specifics later on. And sometimes these things aren't as important to you, but then they can cause some difficult conversations later on. So if there are certain things, definitely get into it now and have these conversations. Next thing, kind of going forward. So important things that you need to make a list is obviously having the ideas of what you are looking for, but then where are you and seeing kind of how you stack up. So a big, big piece of that is going to be your SAT and ACT scores. So right now, you know, toward the end of junior year is really a key point. So what is your recommendations and how to support your students through SAT and ACT scoring at this time?
Yeah, this could be really confusing, especially for parents, you know, because it's really a trade-off between a score and the essay quality, in my opinion, when you're getting to junior year. And it can be really difficult because, you know, maybe you think that you can do better and you're like, you really want to push yourself and devote more time to studying. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we're not compromising on the quality of essays. So it's important for parents to start to have discussions about how, you know, students might stack up to their list of schools that they're interested in. It's important to also meet with your counselor at this time because they can help give you a realistic overview of, hey, like you have this score, these are the types of schools you should be looking at. And if you you know, are able to have that conversation with your student, it'll make it so much easier for you to decide whether or not, you know, continuing to test is a good idea or not. One big consideration that I'd like to put out there for parents is that the timeline for essays definitely starts earlier than you think. We have most of our students starting to write their essays over the summer, so it can be really difficult for, you know, juniors, current juniors right now who are going to start writing essays in just a few months to also devote time to studying for the SAT or ACT. So I think this is a really good conversation to have with your student, but also involve your counselor in this conversation because they can provide you with examples of past students and, you know, how things have gone for individuals who are still trying to decide if it's worth it to devote more time to studying versus devote time to beginning their essays.
Those are some great points. The conversations of when to stop testing or not stop testing is hard. But I absolutely agree with what you're saying about, you know, it is a mixture of the scores and the essay quality. So time better spent is usually what I typically try to lead the conversation with. So That's really, really great point. And then it kind of lends into my next question, which is how are we spending our summer?
Yes, this is always just such a, heated conversation sometimes with students because they want to stack up their resume last minute, and then parents want them to focus on something else. And I think this is, really a difficult decision to reach sometimes. But here's some pointers that can hopefully help. So first of all, we want to say that you should keep your current activity. So if you've been volunteering at the hospital for 3 years, this is not necessarily the time to stop. You should stay busy, have things outside of essays. You're going to need a break from all the essay writing you're doing anyways. So it's important to stay busy, but maybe you have to decide whether or not you can do like a formal research program that's 40 hours a week versus, picking up a few shifts here and there for volunteering. You have to really think about how much time is being devoted to either project. This is a discussion that you can have with your students, and you can also check with your counselor to see if they think that there's any gaps in your resume. If they really think that you need to pick up a few extra hours for volunteering or shadowing, clinical experiences, whatever it may be, they'll let you know, and that's something that you can try to fit into the summer. But we also don't want to overburden students who, should really be spending time working on their college applications, because it is a very time-consuming process. It's something that a lot of students don't realize until they start. If you have many colleges on your list, every college will require different essay supplementals, and it can really get overwhelming quickly. And the deadlines come up faster than you think, because another thing students forget is that school starts in August for most states, or early September. And a lot of our students are taking, rigorous coursework. It can be really hard to balance everything once school starts. That's why we really want to use that summer to set us up as well as we can. Another thing is also discussing travel plans over the summer. So this is definitely, something in the parents' hands. So it's important to note that it's okay to travel, but you should really understand the amount of work that a student should be putting in over the summer. It's really different going on like, a weekend getaway, or like, less than a week versus being gone for a month. And this can also cause a lot of undue stress to students because they feel like they're behind. They're talking to their friends who have already written essays, and I've personally seen a lot of students get really stressed out right before school starts because they feel like they weren't able to make as much progress over the summer as they had hoped to. So that's another big consideration, that parents, you have a little bit more control over. So definitely something to think about before you book any trips for the summer.
Great points. I really liked what you said about, you can go away for the weekend, but keeping in mind when you start school again. Not every state is the same. Applications are due the same time regardless. So if you're someone that has been out of school, since May, and you go back in August versus another student, who is out of school end of June, that doesn't go back till, early September, coming up with a timeline. So your timeline needs to, work around your own plans, but then the timeline for apps is its own thing. Those application deadlines don't change regardless of when your schedule is. So what is like the ideal summer timeline for applications so parents can kind of help guide their students in what they should be doing at what point?
Yeah, sure. So this timeline, like Nicole mentioned, it's more so based on college application deadlines and less based on the school. So you can work with your counselor to make sure that all of these, tasks and timeline milestones to reach can work around your personal schedule as well based on your school. But this is generally what we will tell students to make sure that they're meeting the national deadlines for college applications. So meetings with counselors will begin as early as March or April to figure out a game plan for the application cycle. And the first couple meetings will generally include a college list meeting, and then we also have an intro that we give to the personal statement. during these intro meetings, so a lot of students will end up having more than one intro to the personal statement or intro to essay writing meeting. We do a lot of brainstorming, and I find myself going back to this first meeting even, really late in the application cycle in November or December, because these meetings are super, super important for setting up students for success and for seeing, for really digging deep into what some ideas might be for essay writing. So it's important to get these started early so that you're setting yourself up for success in the future. Then outlining and brainstorming really starts to take hold in May/June, and we always try to start writing by June or July. That just, is the best timeline that we've noticed in the past for students to have the least amount of stress. And then a bulk of essay writing will try to make sure that it takes place over the summer vacation months, once again, because you really want to get a head start on this before school starts up again. And then we'll obviously work with everyone's personal schedule to make sure that they're on track. But that's just a tentative timeline, but it's coming up fast because we're about to hit February, and it's really definitely going to creep up on students before they expect it. So it's important to be aware of these timeline milestones to hit.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think that was super, super helpful. Like I mentioned before, next podcast will be really a highlight and specifics into how to build a great college list. So make sure to like and subscribe so you get the notification for when that's out and ready to listen. And we will see you next time.